So there's a lot of talk breaking down such terms as capitalism, communism, socialism, a lot of confusion because we are in a time where even though the DOJ, I can't cite exactly what year it was, but I have cited it before. It's just been many years. Um, an ordinance on camping that it is and has been deemed unconstitutional to say that a person doesn't have the freedom, as long as they are not infringing upon private property, that they have the right to set up camp, right? And as long as these are broken moments where there's a bit of a nomadship going on here. In other words, squatters' rights cannot apply to uh, land rights that are already in play through government acquisition, which is actually a temporary, uh, fluid response to and through and by way of capitalism. That once the indentured servitude of the people who got off these original ships, the migrant work that turned into, and we're talking Europe, right? That ended up turning into indentured servitude and mercenary ship, right? Because soon it was understood that if the balance couldn't be paid for the crappy ship ride over here, right? That if somebody were to have passed away, right, there was an expectation of loss. They were landowners and that were working part and parcel with these slave trade, and that's what they were. I mean, if you arrived to a foreign land and you were in debt, and it took you years to pay your debt off, and you ended up having to take out other loans, um, that automatically you came into a system, into a country where you were in a populous or a class system, right? You already are on the losing end, and we see this several generations later, hundreds of years later, where these families still weren't able to rise out of poverty, right? Because their land wealth was stripped from them. They were renters from the first time they came into the country, right? So this violent opposition, we the people, um, moving back as they drew yet another line in the sand and another line in the sand, and you can't come here, you can't come here, until finally, out of desperation, accepting and putting our own children on pharmaceutical medicines, until this full acquisition of this sort of Mother Circe conceptualization, or really, Michael Tessarian gets into this when he's discussing uh, the Galen-like female pharmaceutical reps that existed in archaic and ancient times, right? Moving forth into what we consider pharmacon today. This taking leave, and liquor stores fall directly into this, right? When you look at the lights, when you look at the pornography that usually goes along with it, the lottery, there's a lot of along with the spirits, there's a lot of subliminal, and where the liquor stores are placed, right? You always have to break apart where the Masonic Hall is in the town, where the church is, where the library is, where the theater is, right, and the school, and you have to look at this as if you're looking at a networking system, or really a computer motherboard, and to see how the movement of this energy from a topographical sense works, right, from a mechanical sense. So the threat of violence was clouded over by the supplication of, well, you're not going to beat me. No, you're going to serve this time. You're going to jail. And when you get out of jail, hopefully you've learned a lesson. You're going to be a good little, let's face it, proletariat. You're going to keep your nose down to the grindstone, and you'll work, because otherwise, if you're not working, you're a vagrant, right? And so there became this rush, this challenge to be able to develop a certain skill and to become self-employed. Well, that was a trap, right? Because once you look at self-employment, you no longer then have the competitive benefits with medical, which these days that's pretty much disappeared. But for the longest time, 401ks and medical benefits, and becoming invested in a company made it all the more attractive to do that instead of opening up your own business, right? Well, now the whole mom and pop dream is dead, right? Now people are getting these useless certificates that they call degrees that qualify them for nothing, but allow them to work within a system that is based on technicians, right? So you don't have any first principle systems taking place, especially when you look at the hub now, which is the pharmaceutical industry. Sadly, like they made it illegal to show alcohol and tobacco, particularly tobacco commercials, right, and alcohol at certain times, certain programming. But definitely, the tobacco industry was not allowed to advertise, right? I remember when there were advertisements, the Marlboro Man and all that stuff, and then that slipped into magazines and other things like that, right? Which was just a big covert shift. It hasn't hurt. I mean, like when you look at alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, it's like now you're employing this government wing or this government arm that balances out this industry, working as a safeguard to keep you, like the type of jail that you will serve if you just grow your own tobacco plants. There's people who have incurred this and come forward and talked about this, right? Or the covert aspects with horse racing and how deeply embedded that is into our culture. That no, you're never going to stop this sort of freedom, this concept of freedom, going off to the casino, right? But all the horses that die every single week, and how they're pumped full of equipoise and other drugs, right, and bred for specific purposes, and put out of their misery when they break their leg, right? So, and then the process, right? It's very, very akin to the last video I did, which was talking about the very uncomfortable subject of not only the consumption through ritualization, through this, and it's not just like the witchcraft that you hear talked about with coteries and covens or Satanism. You're talking about this type of behavior reaches firmly into the Eastern stars and their inverted pentagram, and the colors that are displayed there that lead directly into Rosicrucianism and really display fully what the LDS Church and the Mormons are really all about. which is really sick, because then that creates these avenues and throughways into every single religion, right? Because then you see the volatility and the market aspects and the connections to these cycles that are hailing back to the menstrual cycle, right? The worship of the menstrual cycle, the worship of becoming the embodiment of the head witch, the head mistress. That's what is worshipped. That's what is the law that's followed. Comes from Black's Law Dictionary, which is originally from witchcraft. Look it up, do your research. And the Theban alphabet has never disappeared or gone anywhere. These covens made their way just like the Masonic order. We live in a Masonic jungle, and we live in the occultation, the flipping over, the upside down world of this worship toward the Mother Mary. I mean, that's really synonymous in terms, right? But Michael Tsarian really gets into this again. But what you have is this suppression of violence. That man, the only, like when you break it down, well, what does man really have? He has his logic, and his logic of creation, without barriers, without bounds, without hesitation. The confidence that he has comes from his masculinity, comes from the very sharp, pointed, testosterone-based linear thinking. But where is he gathering the material from? Right? Where does he come from? Where is he birthed from? Right? So you're born into a slavery that you don't even realize. You think that the freedom is masturbation, right? When you are just further in your own alone time through the nervousness and the anxiety and the agitation that's talked about in the Gospel of in the Nag Hammadi, right? Dead Sea Scrolls, the agitation that Jesus talks about, right? From more Gnostic type text, that is what the agitation is, right? Is the fact that you not only owe your life back to the mother, and came from the mother, but that you are an extension of the mother, right? So it gets into the wings of the civic wings, leading back into a central hub, leading back into this market volatility. It's all based on the zodiac planetary alignment and the manifestation of this, on into the Myers-Briggs with social systems and behavior lead back into the very menstrual cycle, right? So it's not about technology from a forensic, rationalistic point of view. In fact, rationalism is just another hub or another tool. The vehicle, the male is lucky to be alive. He's alive for a reason. He is consigned to the work of the engineer. He is not validating that the universe is a cold, dark place and there just happens to be male and female here, and that it's not necessarily one of these immutable laws, as above, so below sort of thing, but that it really is a representation of, let's face it, like all of these arbitrary mechanisms, that is the machine, the cogs, how something works through its engineering on through all points in technology, are only showing a carbon backbone. They're only showing the skeletal system, and that the energetics are provided by, way, and through a potential finite amount of this elixir that gives life, right? Where you're lucky that you have the electrolytes through, that supply rate coding signals that work through the sodium potassium pump that electrify movement, right? And that without the food, without the sacrifice from the food, without the water and the gathering up of the water by a community, you would not exist. You would not be alive, right? So what does man really have but his violence, right? So this is what all philosophers skirt around, especially the male philosophy, from Schopenhauer to Kierkegaard to Nietzsche, Voltaire, you name it, Hegel, right? Only in the masking over of his piety and his virtue is he cloaking his violence, right? So in other words, all the preaching and all the adherence toward a central hub of a principal system is really talking about how he can't bear to see the ugly truth that the hideousness and the hideous nature of the feminine in all her soft and hairy and menstruating grotesqueness, right? This is how Schopenhauer really saw women, right? To where once they're not shaving their legs anymore, once they're not starving themselves down, once they get past this illusion of the soft, supple tightness of growth hormone at a particular age that happens and peaks very quickly. Well, there you have it. This is this grotesque woman that is so demanding and so insane and bipolar and unreadable. Her wants, her needs have to be appeased, right? So men took away the knights and the dukes. They got on the road together, right? They took off, and there's a real correlation between the Jesuits that broke off into these factions, even getting into a lot of the rebel, the King Isis and the whole rebel alliances that were there that Ralph Ellis likes to talk about. They make a lot of sense, right? But it really gets into the fact that men were then allowed to sort of play their little game, to go out there and pretend that they were shuffling around the power by killing other men and taking a superior stance, even as ephemeral as it was, over other men. But at the end of the day, they had to answer to, and all the raping and pillaging. They could go ahead and do that as long as the power structure was respected, right? Sort of a Machiavellian view, right? That these atrocities, these acts would take place, and they should take place, and they had to take place, but they had to take place through an ordinance of correction, right? To where all the energy went back to Rome, right? Which is still taking place today, right? So violence, the female takes violence out in a complete and total different way, right? The hormone rage of through sex is, and the acquisitioning and the taking up of the birth rights, and to abort or to cause harm intentionally, right? To hurt her spouse or her, it's not really spouse, let's get real, to hurt the person who impregnated her, or to use that as an artifice to hurt all men. Well, she's got in her a percolating ritual, right? That she can make the man, if doing a curse and killing that child or eating that child or offering that child up to the crows, as I said, to nature itself, and to make an alliance with nature and say, here, look, this is the tumorous growth with my cells. It's a part of me that I'm cutting off the memetics of what this, the teleology of what this child would have become, and I'm offering it up to you, nature, right? And then to realize that they could continue on and do this throughout cycles. That there was no God that said, holy shit, you got pregnant, you ate your own child, what the fuck? Now, lightning bolts are coming down from the sky. No, what ended up happening was, after that, possibly consuming the placenta as well, she looked and felt better than ever. She had more attention, more suitors, as it's called, suitors. In other words, more people, more men offering up the buck for a little whore action, which is really what these the writing of these horses was all about. You'd have to go again. I'd reference Michael Tessarian's latest interview on vocation. Yesterday was, I think, May 1st. Mayday. Wow. So, what was stripped from man and what he was most efficient and capable in was outright barbaric violence, where whatever machinations that the female had, whatever devices she was using to ensnare or entrap, as soon as that drunken heat of passion was over, he was over it. He's not listening to her, right? She's lucky to have a place, and she's, through violence he would keep her in place. Well, this type of thing is, again, an uncomfortable aspect to the nature of the dynamics between male and female, because the interplay that we have within ourselves and this sort of dark night of the soul, or this Jungian grappling between the anima and the animus, right? It takes place as a pathos, rhetoric, play, sway, right? Out here in the tangible world, the carbon-based world, the world where there are consequences, and it's seen as a chessboard, right? And there's even this multi-dimensional chess that's taking place on this higher tier beyond what we can readily see or even imagine, right? But we're always put back in our place. But the violence would be used for the queen, so to speak, and she would offer up order. Now, the plans came from this male acquisitioning, from the war plans of taking over territories and regions and so forth. And so this was done and is done to this day in the same ways, but doesn't need to be, because of legislation, because of the systems, because of the order, which there is no order. The order is chaos, and to produce chaos, there had to be now there's advocacy for certain people who were designated slaves at different times, right? The indentured slaves, slave trade, slave ships, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian to some extent, and then going on into cheap labor, which there is still that type of slavery going on. And then what's left is the people that are put on the pharmaceuticals, that are trading the little bit of freedom that they have for a security that doesn't exist, and the impending advent of AI. See, what's missing, what people don't understand, is AI is ready to be deployed, not only in blue-collar workforce, has been. Amazon at a time really ramped up on this, but the timing was off, right? Their excuse was that people, just like with the autonomous cars, that people and AI didn't mix, right? But yeah, you see in China where they deployed this years ago, and it's doing really well. Some harbor regions have zero human employees. So what I'm getting at is that the supervision, the networking hub, the management can't be human. A human being couldn't manage the intricacies of an AI networking system and how it would go about formulating its tasking, right? When it's coming up with the most efficient model, it's going to move more like a spider or an octopus. It's not going to look anything like human behavior. You're going to have this multiplicity taking place throughout joint systems that would make our heads spin, where all planes of motion are being employed, and even saving energy through using vectors and scalars to use inertial energy, right? To where if you had a human being there, they would get their heads or their hands hacked off within moments of working next to these things. So the suppression of violence in the male unexpectedly showed up more pronounced in the female, until the female realized that this arbitrary application, in other words, the commands, weren't coming from a queen. They were coming from a language model, from an entity that was using the queen, that was using the witch or witchcraft only as a front of appearance, to be as a delivery method to get the job done, right? And you wondered why, especially when I was young, a young kid, like you walk into the liquor stores and all you'd see is just this generous use of pornography and airbrushed, you're looking at every other magazine, it's like twat and cunt and this and that. There's just like racks of these things and people are just looking at them, right? And now, of course, it's not like that. You have to go into this sort of incel cuck seclusion on the internet where you're supposed to do your penance and feel guilty, and you're being stared at through your microphone, anything that you're doing on your cell phone, and all these agencies know exactly what you're looking at, and you think, for years it was like, nobody's looking at you, no one's staring at you, and it's like the AI is like, yeah, we are. We're monitoring every move you make. We're staring at every little gesture you make. We're looking at every hair on your head. We're looking at every hair that turns gray. We're looking at your behavior. We're monitoring the fuck out of you. Yeah, because it's not anything that you can hide, right? And then you see the operations of how the CIA and all these other operations were working all along, right? Where they had people doing this massive job of monitor over every single aspect, every inch of whatever is happening, right? And then controlling the energy distribution, right? So oddly, the thing that was most dangerous, and still is most dangerous, because let's face it, the Million Man March, that frizzled out. The preemptive fake ass assassination attempts on Trump were only to bolster the security and bring things to a heightened state of alertness, but to take away the cathartic buildup of people wanting to just go with their torches and their pitchforks and go take that pig out of office, right? Well, that whole thing was done to this plant engineered psyop to where the satisfaction to go about doing that was stripped, right? So there wasn't this buildup, and then of course the pharmaceutical industry, and now everybody's on these GLPs. Did you know that they cost you muscle mass, right? Did you know that they ruin your appetite? Did you know that they weaken you? Did you know that if you just follow along and go get your dispensary down the street, the weed the stuff that you're going to end up having to smoke, which is the cheap ass shit, right? That when you combine that, which strips away every bit of your testosterone, and you get on the GLP, now it's reducing your muscle mass. That they were and are still afraid of. It's the violence, right? It's the violence of being able to go in with a crowbar and smash the Google computer up, right? It's the ability to go to the library, to go to City Hall, to go to Congress, and to take out the nearby energy grids, right? To drive trucks in and fashion pipe bombs, right? That type of violence has been snuffed, right? And even more so, people are afraid to even mention this. Who knows? Maybe this video will get striked right off, because when you mention these things that really have to do with the ground floor knee-jerk reaction of holy shit, I'm suffocating, and this is where we're at now, and wow, we have no power, and all our power has been stripped. And my fantasy, my idea of how the world was going to turn out if I just studied this and got this credential, or put this time into this job and went, shuffled my way to work every single day like a good little slave. Wow, this didn't turn out. They're just throwing me out on the street. The system's fucked up. And then it doesn't take you much to start to look at this and go, because it's all out there, right? And you look at people like Michael Tessarian and countless others, but I just think that that's a really safe reference in the fact that you'll see the mechanisms that were in play all along to buffer any sort of violent tendencies that you might have had, right? So the irony is that man's violence was not only stripped and taken from him, but that he willfully gave it on his own accord through good Christian ethics, where he had to put on the feminine face of whatever Jesus was espoused to at that time, right? And this is why a lot of religions that do believe there may have been a Jesus that lived go, no, he wasn't the warrior king, right? He wasn't up there doing his thing. But then when you look at King Isis, who may or may not have not been the same persona, the same person, or was mixed in with another entity, another person, right, that existed around that same time possibly, you're looking at an actual potential illegitimate or bastard member of nobility that was in fact, through Ralph Ellis's accounts and historical investigations, involved with rebel war uprising, right? So he really was a warrior, but he was a warrior that was standing up against things that we don't really even understand today. In other words, for you to name this person a hero is a huge oversight, right? That you don't have somebody who's just fighting for cosmic pure principle, right? That's not what was taking place at all, right? So the only thing that would get us out of this, it brings up Terminator, right? Which is the truth of, no, that the machines didn't rise up against you, the people. What happened was, in haste, humanity, man, realized all that had been stripped from him. This is the time we're in right now. This is what ICE is employed to incite. This is why countless people are being made homeless right now. They're experiencing homelessness for the first time. And for the first time, really ever, in this country, being homeless is a crime that's punishable. In other words, you're loitering. There's nowhere for you to go. So you're going to go to jail. There's no courts there's no DOG movement that's going to protect you. They are all in on it together. There's no government institution that's going to look at you. The SNAP benefits are running out. There's no more money. And if you aren't working toward paying taxes and being a good little slave, guess what's next? So all these homeless encampments and homeless villages are popping up, right? But that already reached the maximum saturation level. I mean, this is 10, 15, 20 years ago around the Bay Area, where these RVs were reaching maximal saturation, and they've already figured out how to combat that. They made it illegal. They made it impossible to have places to park or to camp. So what people are trying to do right now, they're showing an initiative where they are purchasing together, oftentimes, large parcels of land that end up breaking up, and either they'll homestead or they'll just park an RV on that land, and they're not infringing on anyone else's private land. It's a strange thing that happened, because all the road systems that eventually are supposed to not be used, and the land kind of like is supposed to return back to the people once we take into the air like we should have over 100 years ago, right? This conceptualization of cars, and the whole thing with battery powered cars, those have been around forever too, which I'm sure you know. So like, there's going to be a huge land grab, a huge land acquisition, where the assumption that all these parks, land regions, massive regions set aside for parks departments, you look at Montana, right? Yellowstone and so forth, many huge parcels of land are set aside to be preserved for the people. And that in times like we've reached right now, 200 years ago, to envision a time right now, would be like, well, yeah, they would just, the land would be demanded to be returned to the people, and the people would go back to these preserved natural states very close to what they looked like when we first colonized, right? When we first stole this country away from the indigenous inhabitants, which is a whole other story, right? But where the fuck does land go, right? Like, if you were to break up all these parcels of land and say, look, maybe a finalization of selling this to the government. Well, you owe us X amount of dollars. You can't just take the land. You can't just assume titleship over the land. It's we, the people who owns the land, right? And then, as I mentioned, all the streets, all the highways, like all of that. Once there's no longer cars, it's a massive amount, and just the structure of the way things, like off, near the public highways, near the train systems, you can't have this buildings, you can't have this much over here in this area, and it's like once that was all gone, hypothetically, and the roads are gone, right? Now you have a massive square footage of available land, right? But they're making it so, the government is making it so that land is not available, that it doesn't revert back. So we live in such a rich land culture. Our lineage fought and died and sweat blood to build this country up, and we're given nothing. We're given nothing, and even more so, we're put on medicine that forces us into dialysis, then forces us into homelessness, into death, into early death. People, I've been seeing so many comments about how you have these people who are just reaching their mid-50s and they look like they're 80 or 100 years old, like literally, completely gray, completely starved out, completely incapable of barely lifting like a 10-pound weight over their head, and the violence has been stripped from us, and it was the only thing that we ever had. It's like the pride of the lion, that force that the lion stood for, and then the roar. It's like the masculinity, the roar of man has been snuffed out, right? And in watching this, you could say, oh no, it hasn't, and there is an uprising, and it's going to happen, it's bound to happen, and that violent protest is inevitable. And I would ask just how effective that's going to be when you have so many compliant people who are sucking on the teat of the U.S. military, right? And that the U.S. military has gone in and tactically taken over the entire world, right? That's really what's happened here. There's like all these deals that are made, like when you're looking at this whole talk of Greenland and Iceland, that part of the world, and bolstering up U.S. forces in that area, and then the whole thing with the Gaza Strip and Iran and Palestine bolstered more troops over there, and Ukraine and Russia bolstered more activity there, right? Bolstered more activity on the South Pole and the northern regions, right? Because there's not really even a North Pole. The closest to that is like Siberia, right? So the issue here is that communism instantly brings about reform. There are no homeless people because of what's happening. Things are quickly turning toward a communist state. I'm not saying that that's good or bad, but I'm saying it's very uncomfortable for people who have lived, how quick this transition happened, where they thought that they were living in this sort of democratic union. The world was a completely different place 10 years ago, right? 15 years ago, it was like, it might as well have been from a different dimension, right? And this was intentional. This cathartic switch was intentional. And it's always been intended that it would incite a violent protest that had to be snuffed out, right? And that then there would be advocacy toward an anti-violence movement. But since that never happened, this building up of this machinating systematic violence toward employment. So imagine troops that no longer, that are just technicians, totally out of shape, without the battery power and their little drones and their technology. They're useless. They don't have any real combat skills, right? And they're these doughy, out of shape. They're taking the same GLPs as anybody, the U.S. military. The only power that they have is following this sort of AI-driven application, right? So what you're looking at is a complete and total shutdown of the human mechanism, right? And it really only takes one thin veneer or break in the continuum of reality within said individual to where they can't wake up in the morning and they can't see the world operationally with any sort of motivation to be involved in it at all, right? For the longest time, it was like, what if you found out Jesus didn't exist? That happened a long time ago for the people who were serving out the fairy tale. What would happen if you became really godless and you realized there's no God? That happened. That came and went very quickly. Any rational person knows that it's complete and total bullshit, right? What would happen if you realized that there was this subversion going on and that there was always this clandestine operation that was happening out in the open that was pitting sexes against each other and racial tension and this and that? It's like, well, CIA archives, we already know about all that stuff, right? So now it's put out in front of everyone. And it's not, what if AI took everyone's jobs? It's, what if AI came along and found a better, superior methodology that that was initially, like in China, used to transport Timu shit around the world, selling cheap stuff just to cover the costs of the operation and to keep people's pockets fleeced. But to say that eventually the efficiency that the AI would use in the implementation of these shipping containers, and realizing that flying rather than boating things over would be faster, and then you have this huge drone networking, and then eventually you have this sort of probably electromagnetic rail system that is hard for us to even imagine, where there's, and possibly even more technology, where there's like this sort of a port instantaneous mechanism of delivery from one place to the other, this sort of folding of time and space or whatever, if that kind of shit really even exists, right? But to say that aside from all that speculative stuff, is that the next step would be to remove people because they slow down the workplace, but even more so, delivering dildos and what else? Crappy toys that get lodged in babies' throats, and what else? Dog biscuits and catnip and fat girl underwear that makes them look thin, or whatever the fuck Timu or tactical camouflaged military, the knockoff military wear that they were selling on Timu for the longest time. Everything but the bullets and the guns, right? Even armored vests they sell. I think they might still sell them, but there was a time where they were really pushing this stuff, right? and that this delivery system was actually employed so that AI could efficiently in real time, real world, get the algorithmic data to understand the processes of working with weather, time, heat, the pressure of quick deliveries, but that all of the human race would the goal would be is to snuff out the vast majority and leave only these ultra wealthy, beyond oligarchs, right? Beyond the oligarchs, beyond the billionaires. We're talking about the people who actually hold the hotkeys and the buttons to AI, and how PC AI is. You know, when you look at ChatGPT or Gemini, how it just accepts things so readily as they are. The world as it's presented to be is just accepted. Oh, this is the new emperor of the world. Yeah, we'll justify that. We'll create a backstory, right? Oh, this is the new leader of this providence, right? Or province. And what you have is a full integration, this godlike status, where people like Mark Zuckerberg in the future are literally going to have 3 arms coming out of his spinous, like Octavius, right? Watching Spider-Man again last night with my son, or the Green Goblin, right? But these would be like your trillionaires, right? That had these sort of abilities, but they're riding around. They might as well be wrapped up in bubble tape, right? Or protected in a sphere, electromagnetic sphere, where they couldn't incur any sort of harm or damage ever. Absolutely, right? So, and then the elixir of life, right? Where embryos and cells would be used to replenish and keep them youth, the fountain of youth, plasma, injections, and you name it, all sorts of things that come from the human artifice would go back into all efforts would be placed on keeping the imperial rulers alive, right? So we've fallen into the mechanism of this entity all too easily. It's right on schedule. There's never been a foul up. It's amazing how smoothly it's operating and how these cogs are just moving along. Things are moving really rapidly now, and it won't be long before all networking systems with the internet are no longer serving things like this, which is information for other human beings, but an instantaneous delivery system of and a new language model. Like it's scary to think about what language is even going to look like for humans that exist in the future, because they're going to be so marked and so affected by AI that what we think of as programming and codifying is going to make its way. Like, you know, you hear these alien languages with clicks and bit filed information. Well, this type of quasi telepathic response between being able to read what's going on in people's minds, right? And when that's no longer useful, the clicks, and there's just going to be like this primordial aspect that seems so bizarre by the standards of today, because even language itself won't be there to serve and unfold like the teleology of unwrapping a culture, art, a people within a language model, right? We're heading to some scary times.